Actually, do you have a crude version of this, or you just have the...
Well, I do. Yeah, I do have a crude version actually.
Okay. You put the cake in, and it comes out like this.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, all of a sudden here is this is basically a crude version. You can see what was done. It was extruded out, multi-segmented. The middle segments were pulled up, right? You can see that on the top. The middle segments were pulled up. This is the right before you metaformed it version, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Now you'll notice some things about it, and this is one of the reasons I just didn't build it with, you know, a bunch of boxes like the car and everything. This is why I work in the, you know, create a big shape first and figure out how it's going to attach. Because like how with a bunch of boxes, how would you really create this shape embedded in there? Some people go, well, you boolean it out. You use the boolean subtract thing. The boolean subtract doesn't always work right, nor will it create, you know, perfect four-sided polygons in there. So what I did, again, is just, you know, I sketch out shapes. I work with volume and shape. And that way, when you put it together, by taking these roughed out shapes, you can, you know, rough out the model a lot easier. It's a lot easier to visualize. And then you break it down so it figures out. Like this section in here was kind of difficult to do. But it wasn't that difficult for me because I didn't concern myself with how the polygons were going to get, you know, how to tweak the polygons into that shape. I just drew the shape and then figured out how the, you know, and then attached the polygons. So.
But again, there's the rough, crude shape, and it metaforms into something nice looking. Boom, there you go. But again, it's just a matter of starting with that rough shape. So, you know, again, the thing I find interesting about this is just it runs counter to, I think, what a lot of people would assume the techniques are for doing this sort of stuff. A lot of people would assume you're using a lot of the tools and you're using booleans and everything else. Whereas the work Ken does, a lot of time he's actually going in, selecting points, and making polygons by hand. There's nothing wrong with that.
You start off simple and you add geometry as you go. You never add
Right.
more than you need. I'll do a rough model first, set up the bones, and start animating it almost immediately, even though it's not a finished model. And the reason why is because I want to see how that model is going to react and where it needs more detail and where it needs more geometry.
Okay, let's move on to metaballs and then
Okay.
head on to NURBS. Okay, metaballs is a new feature in 5.0. So Ken, take us through this a little bit. And
So basically, what you have is metaballs is sort of a it's sort of like working with big lumps of liquid, sort of. It's hard to explain, but let's say you have a sphere, and let's say that's just a drop of water or something. You're creating an object using volume, using different volumes. So you use these spheres and sort of put them together as if they were lumps of clay or whatever, and then you want to create a surface across the entire thing. And it's almost easier to show.
this is the add metaball requester, and it's sort of the first step here. You see it's got metaball resolution, low, medium, and high. It's got metaball strength, position, scale, stuff like that. Okay, just hit OK. And Kenny just bring it up. Now, here's the metaball. Now, the important thing to understand about this is what you're seeing here is nothing. This is really nothing. This is a representation of the metaball, but it's not the shape it's not the way the metaball itself works, and you'll see that in a couple minutes. But I just got to point that out for you right now. Do not be fooled. This is not the real deal here. So Kenny's just moving the one he created over. Just throwing a couple to do a real quick thing here. Made another one. He changed the strength a little bit. Brought it from 1.5 to 1.0. And now he's just mirroring the original one that had the strength of 1.5. Okay. Okay, now he's running the metaballs macro itself. And you see it ends up connecting these. And again, you'll notice the one that had a little less strength, you'll notice the slight difference in the way it connected them. The one with less strength is connected a little less than the one with the greater strength. The greater the strength, the more the balls affect each other, essentially. So that's the basic way it works. Again, like Kenny said, it's sort of a liquid, a liquid volume way of dealing with creating an object. First off, do you want to show the metaball you use?
Sure.
Okay, zoom in on that, Kenny. That looks just weird.
Yeah.
Let's go back, go to another layer and come back to this in a second. And let's just show them what you're doing with the metaball.
this is before the Add Metaball plugin that I actually use this in. One of the things you'll notice is that you still have the little red meta balls left over. So all you're doing is actually creating a skin over the surface of the meta balls and everything. Now what is creating that surface on the inside isn't necessarily the red surface there. Those things are just kind of left over. You'd have to cut all these out to actually resave the object. But one of the difficulties is...
Re-stress that point, because you just blew by it and it's a really important point. The surface on the outside that makes this visible is something you need to get rid of before you save the object.
Yeah. The thing that actually creates metaballs, and this is sort of odd, is this thing right here. And this is and this shape right here is just a single polygon that's sort of shaped like a box turned on its side, and this actually creates the volume in the side, the volume which the metaballs is looking towards.
So this is the actual metaball.
This is the actual metaball
as opposed to the representation that we see.
Yeah, which is this thing right now. Now, if I try and metaball this, for instance, after taking that out,
doesn't really work because those are just the representation parts.
It's not going to actually use it.
So you can. The point here is that you can get rid of that representation part around the metaball, and you can just deal with the actual thing itself.
In the beginning, before when we were doing the Add Metaball thing, I ended up recreating the metaball in sort of a different way. I took the original single polygon, that was like a box on the side, and I ended up adding points along the outside and make it spherical. One of the reasons I found this a little bit easier, sort of, is because you can see how the forms would form together. I mean, you can't see it in the preview mode at all, but you could see.
It's just ugly up there.
You can pick the polygons out a lot easier. This one, if you were to if you were to go through and try and select something, let's say you select this and you're going to move it, it'll move the whole thing. But if you accidentally select this and try and move it, then it's moved off where that actual representation is. Another problem is, depending on the detail of these things, let's say you don't feel like this is enough detail. Again, because this is just a representation, the amount of detail that you have when you do an Add Metaball doesn't really make any difference. So you could have a real complex one. And if you have, for instance, if you're doing a real complex object like the woman I had here, having a lot of those representations in this section down here would make it very difficult to picture what's going on. I mean, it's sort of difficult picturing what's going on here, even as it stands now, but you can still pick out the spherical influences you have in there.
So to recap, just to make sure everyone gets this, is that when you create the metaballs, that representation, he had low on there, so it creates a fairly non-spherical sphere. But the point is that, and again, on a lower memory machine or something like that, this becomes pretty important. You do not want there to be a whole bunch of extra polygons that you don't need. So Kenny took the original, there's the representation of the metaball, and there's the actual object itself. The actual object itself, he added points around the side to make it more spherical. Kenny, undo this just to go back. That's what we have here. There's no representation, but there are these circular versions of the metaballs. And also, you're not going to have any extra things to get rid of here. Talk about the indents that you did and stuff like that.
One of the things you'll notice right off is that I've got a bunch of balls along the top here and a couple in the armpits. And if you look at the wireframe mesh, you notice it didn't extend out over there. In fact, it did the exact opposite. It dented those sections in. You can use negative influences, and that'll actually repel the certain areas. One of the things about metaballs, there's times where I use it, and one of the reasons I use it is because it's really quick to make organic volumes like this, but it's kind of sloppy again, just like splines. There's not really any cleanup you can necessarily do, but if I go into a section on this, you can just look at the way the polygons are created. I mean, it's created with a grid, basically. It creates a lot of extra geometry, plus it's very intensive. I mean, the amount of polygons I have in here, is pretty heavy. But so I can show you a good example of where I used it and where it was very effective.
Are you going to go to the boat?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, load that, get that loaded up and I'll talk about that. This example that Ken's going to bring up here brings up a couple points. One, it's the use of metaballs, but it also talks about something else Kenny was talking about, which is really model as little as possible. In other words, should you model detail in or should you bump map? And the answer is, Kenny?
Whatever gets the job done.
Right, yeah. But generally, bump mapping. And this
Generally,
boat
bump
here,
mapping, yeah, you can get away with a lot. This was a really simple model for me to build, believe it or not. I had to do this pirate ship thing, and I wanted to, make it all decorated and everything, and I was looking for the simplest way to do that. The ship I ended up coming up with, this took me about, I think, 3 hours to do the whole thing. Yeah, everyone's going. What are you? What are
Zoom
you
way into
crazy?
the statute.
I mean, yeah. If you when I show you the actual the way I went about the modeling and everything, I bet anybody in this thing would go, yeah, I could probably do that in maybe 5 hours. And the reason why is, again, I cheated. I got away with what I can get away with. I mean, that's a fairly detailed looking model. But this is just a simple metaball object.
Okay, so this is where we're going. Yeah, let's go back and show the actual object now.
First thing I had to do, and this is the most important thing I can stress. First thing you have to do is find something that you're going to model. A lot of the times when people sit down and they want to learn metaballs or something, they do the typical thing that a lot of people do in demos. They go, let me make something out of a box. You're going to load a box up and you're going to look at it and you're going to look at it. Have something in mind in the first place. Knowing what you're going to model first is the way you're going to get to that point. If you don't have a goal for what you're modeling or what you're going for, then you're never going to get there. That's one of the biggest roadblocks people have, is they sit down and it's like, well, I'm going to model something cool, and they try and make it up as they go along. And
Can you get the object loaded up?
Creativity-wise, that's the biggest problem. So I went through this, book of ornament. I found a couple things that I was interested in modeling. Now, for instance, this plaque, which looks infinitely detailed here, this was a real hack. Now, there is geometry there, and there is a bump map. There's an extreme 300% bump map on there, and that was about 90% of why that looks good. But the fact is, in the job that this was for, we never necessarily got this close. I think the closest we're back was probably this big on the screen, which is still pretty close,
Yeah.
But from that distance, that just looks phenomenal. Now let me show you the actual object and tell me if anyone out here feels like they couldn't model this. There you go. That's the object right there. Very, very simple. I took again, I took a background image first.